Hello, I believe we are live. So I am here today to introduce you all to Professor Taka Tanaka, who is presenting today Digging in the Archive, Sumi Harada, the Intellectual. And Taka has a master's degree from Cal State Fullerton in sociology. He's also teaching at Mount SAC and Cal State Fullerton in sociology as well. And he is a second year graduate student at UC Riverside in the Ethnic Studies doctoral program. Let's all welcome Professor Taka, as he likes to be called. And Taka, please start us off. I know we're going to be talking today about your internship at the Riverside Museum and just all the wonderful things you've been finding and discovering by looking at the Harada House archive. So why don't you take us through what you've been discovering?
Yeah, thanks so much, Carol, for that lovely introduction. I think it's been a really great process and a really great relationship that I've been building with the folks at UCR and also in the local Riverside community, particularly at the Museum of Riverside. The folks have been really welcoming in terms of welcoming me in and sort of allowing me to sort of dig in the archive. Not literally, but obviously, looking through some of the archive and sort of interpreting it, I think through, my own particular lens, through my training in sociology and through my training in ethnic studies as well. And so it's been really great to sort of, ping pong ideas with some of the staff and making sure that, I'm kind of approaching things in an authentic way, that I think resonates strongly with the community. So I guess what I wanted to do is first off is to sort of start us off with a little bit of an exercise, Carol. So I know we've been talking a little bit about payback, but maybe this is my payback towards you. But anyway, what I wanted to do was sort of discuss with you all. Let's see here if I can get the what home ownership is, like the home buying process, and what do we think of when we first think of like buying a home? Any sort of thoughts, Carol, possibly?
Well, I know when you're buying a home, you have to go through this loan process and you have to figure out how much your home is worth and if you want to even live in that neighborhood, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think some of the things that we think about is money, right? So
Mhm.
definitely money is something that is always on the, whether or not we have enough for a down payment, right? How we can get a loan, et cetera, right? When my wife and I were looking for homes, we obviously were on Zillow and Redfin and trying to get like a great deal or trying to see how much our homes were valued or going to be valued at, at X amount of time, right? There's this process called escrow, right, which is kind of like this holding place for all the money that goes in there, whether you're the buyer or the seller, right? And obviously this isn't a class in real estate, but I think it gives us a really good idea of like maybe what I'm trying to get at here. Maybe if we're a little bit more socially conscious, we're thinking about gentrification, right? So we have Mimosa Salon over here. This is probably like I'm guessing it's San Francisco, but it'd be kind of nice. I could go for a little mimosa action right now. Maybe some redlining, if we've taken like a social class or an urban planning class, maybe these are some of the things that are very much, at the forefront of what we're discussing here in our today, with where voting areas are, sort of restricted, et cetera. And these are all based on like housing, like where the wealthy people live, right? But maybe these are other things that we can consider too, the state, right? Discriminatory laws, right? Racist neighbors, right? And maybe possibly a superior court case, right? Just to sort of give us an idea of like some of the other things that we might possibly think of when we're thinking about home ownership. And I want us to just hold on to this little bit of this little nugget right here, okay? So what I wanted us to bring us to is sort of go back in time, right, into the 19th and 20th century, right? Because a lot of this sort of home buying was really based on something called, yellow peril, right, or the Chinese exclusion, right? So we had a lot of these sort of, these are some cartoons that or characters that I put up, right? This is the famous sort of Dr. Seuss sort of cartoon, the racist cartoon against Japanese Americans or the Japanese, right? And also at the sort of crux of all of this, we have this thing called the California Alien Land Law. Right? The California Alien Land Law really prevented, and this is like the first sort of law that was really discriminatory against the Japanese and Japanese Americans, in order for them to sort of prevent them from owning like property and owning land, right? And it's had a lot to do with sort of ownership in terms of like agriculture, right? It was very agriculturally centered. And it wasn't really like geared towards like, I guess, private home ownership, but these laws obviously resonated towards this particular, the Japanese community at the time, right? When we look at the Harada House, right? Well, what is the Harada House? Well, what does it mean like this? And maybe we might have heard this in passing, and maybe these are some of the things that we really wanted to unpack here in this seminar, right? Is really for us to understand what is this, right? And basically during this sort of time, Jukichi, right, the owner of the Washington restaurant, right, was basically his son Tadao had passed away at the age of 5 with diphtheria, right? And this had spurred him to decide to purchase a home. Now, because of the alien land law, this essentially prevented him from purchasing a home because he was not an American national. But he was able to circumvent this by purchasing the home in his children's names. And so, as a sort of Christmas uh, gift, I think as what it was called during this trial that had happened with this, right? He ended up winning this case and sort of allowed him to sort of purchase this home for roughly around $1,500, I think, which is roughly around $40,000 in today in 2021 money. But really kind of giving us an idea of sort of how he was able to sort of beat this law, right? And sort of through this like superior court case that had happened because his neighbors did not approve of him living in Lemon Street, living on Lemon Street. I think the address is 3356 Lemon Street today, right? And so this obviously, spurned a lot of press, right? Where we can see the children are presented here to the left, right? And sort of really, this is really like a high profile case that had happened locally in Riverside. And to this day, it's lauded as one of those monumental cases that sort of projects Jukichi and the Harada family in particular, sort of resisting sort of this sort of white supremacist, sort of racist sort of law that was in place in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1910s, right, 1910s. So really, this is where we want to contextualize this, and this is what makes the Harada House such a great sort of American story that gets kind of within its place, right? However, right, what happens later on is obviously the Harada House during World War II, right, where the writing was literally on the wall. These are the initials that were carved in on May 23rd, 1942, which was a Saturday at 7 a.m., right? And it was written by Harold Harada, so one of Jukichi's sons, right? And this spurns again, the mass incarceration that had happened during World War II, right? So this is kind of like the visual representation of that, of the Harada House and and sort of what was at stake at the time, where you have this monumental case, the Superior Court case, where they essentially lost or won their home, right? But then because of incarceration, they ended up sort of losing their home, even though they had someone, staying there and taking care of it for all these years, right? And so this is a very strong sort of family, right? Very very military. A lot of the sons joined the military, right? And I think joined the 442nd regime, the battle regime at the time. Okay, and so we're going to bring it back up to speed, right, to the Harada House today, right, and sort of showing how, recently, this is us, I guess, when we visited the Harada House, and showing how it was we had just recently, in August, right, won a $7 million, funding from the state to sort of restore this house, and it was kept here sort of like intact for so long. And now there's this whole restoration process that's going to be happening in the next, few years to sort of restore the house and sort of where the Museum of Riverside is going to sort of, provide this space, right, for reflection, right, on the sort of, on this sort of, on the history that the Harada House presents. But at the center of this story, right, we have Sumi Harada, who was essentially the curator of the Harada House collection. And I'd like to call her a curator. Some might say that she had just never thrown anything away, right? But she had, been incarcerated in these different camps. She stayed out in Chicago for a while, but she eventually would return to Riverside, where, there's this, where the story goes is that she is, able to sort of present the Harada story in this authentic manner, where she had never thrown away, a lot of the sort of, you know, documentation, the memorabilia, from pre-World War, the years prior to World War II, and essentially like kept like an archive of not only her family history but also of the local sort of Riverside history as well. So she's this central figure that sort of pops up when you're reading about the Harada House, and this is an interesting figure for my research too as well, because it gives me it's an interesting perspective in terms of the way that she's sort of presented within these sort of narratives that you read of the Harada uh, family sort of story, right? She was this sort of elderly lady in her 70s, right, who had this quick wit and sort of silver tongue, I think is what, or sharp tongue rather, right? Yet, Sumi did not stand out in a crowd. She had this diminutive stature, right? This is sort of the narrative that is always sort of presented through this story. And I always felt as though that was a little bit maybe unfair to a person who, stayed at this house and had gone through so much, right? And so throughout this process, right, you're going through sort of the archive that she had kept and really realizing that not only was she just holding on to the history of her family, right? She was holding on to but she was also a person that was very learned. She was very educated. She was very well educated. She had a very strong vocabulary, and reading through her notes that she had kept, it was really important for us to sort of, for me at least, to look at this and think of Sumi not as, someone who was just this frail old lady, right? But someone who had actually had agency, right? Who had, you know, different sort of dimensionalities to her, had a personality, which is very much so, presented within the folks that I've talked to in the community. But I think what is missing is sort of that person that was prior to her maybe latter half or her silver years. And I was able to sort of uncover, unpack some of that within the archive, and really sort of wanted to highlight that today within our discussion. So I want to go ahead and sort of show show you all, but I also want to give out a little bit of a disclaimer, right? Because I think it's really important for me to sort of for you all to understand where I'm coming from, right? I'm still in the process of interpreting these findings, right? These findings are very raw and very fresh, and these are my preliminary analyses, and that's why I think I'm coming off a little bit nervous, because of the fact that I really want us to sort of unpack the material to the best of our to the best of my abilities, right? I really appreciate, your patience and support as I take my time to unpack these findings. And obviously this is a work in progress, right? This is something that I'm trying to sort of delve into, theoretically. So please, if you have any questions, reach out to me directly, because this is still an ongoing process, and maybe some of your insights from the community can really help sort of unpack this sort of this new lens, right? That I think the archive has provided for us with what Sumi has to offer, right? So here's one thing that sort of popped out, and I thought this was kind of interesting, sort of just to lighten things up a little bit. But these are Sumi's recipes that I found. One of them was the divinity fudge, right? And this is very divine, right, Carol? So and obviously if we were in person, like, this is something that I would have I think tried to whip up, or maybe we would have had like a cooking session. Y'all be munching on some of the divinity fudge that Sumi had written down as a recipe, right? And obviously this comes with some help, right, with this deciphering. So thank you, Naomi Harada, for your help in helping me deciphering some of the handwriting of Sumi's. But this looks really great. Some egg whites, some sugar. It looks really simple, right? Right. Next, we have Sumi's chili con carne. So this was not in her handwriting, which I thought was interesting. Which is an interesting sort of analysis. Again, thank you to Naomi, who was able to Naomi Harada, who was able to sort of help decipher this. And so, these are some of the recipes that kind of came through, right? And I know some of the folks that are really familiar with the collection or with the story. There's this like chicken recipe apparently that has yet to sort of surface. So I'm still like, I'm still looking through it and still trying my best to look for that recipe. And so, because I know some of us are really dying I think, dying to get a taste of that as well. And I've heard really great things. But, that was one of the things that Sumi was really known for as a cook, right? She wasn't just this person that was like, quick tempered or had a sharp tongue or what are these sort of adjectives that we see, right? She was a person that I think also, had a really good knack for cooking, and that's a really great sort of, that's a really great sort of dimension that adds to this story, to Sumi's story. So next, what we find is Sumi was a writer and a poet, and I think this is some of the things that I think were overlooked within the archive. And upon further sort of investigation, right, through some of the contacts that I had, she had written under a pseudonym, right, by the name of Carol Harada. So Carol or Carl, right? So we're still trying to unpack this, right? How do we pronounce that with a Y, right? And so these are some of the conversations that have sort of come up, and this is again a finding that I've had, within the past, I mean, this is a few days ago, right? That I'm sort of uncovering a lot of this. So bear with me that this is very raw and very fresh, but I really wanted us to sort of see this through this Tadaima, format, because I think it's really important to sort of understand what Sumi was like as a writer. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of take a stab at this. I really like this piece. It's a short essay, and it's called Insomnia. And I've been dealing with bouts of insomnia leading up to my presentation for today. So I think it's very fitting. And so I'll go ahead and sort of read what Carol Harada had written. Webster simply put insomnia as a state of sleeplessness. There are several major causes and sometimes minor causes of insomnia. It is in most cases a touch of the heart. One's heart is broken, about to be broken, and lastly, one is on the verge of giving away, for better or worse. Someone tosses restlessly from one side of the bed to the other. Then one can indulge in gymnastics, such as high kicking of the pedal extremities or flinging the arms in desperate circles. There still remains the famous tabulation of sheep. Oftentimes the lambkins make so bold as to gambol upon the bed. This is usually due to the fact that the mutton stew was a delicious repast, but still remains impressive. Another trick is to rhyme verses with the infernal ticking of the clock. A splendid one is sleep. Macbeth doth murder sleep. One can creep out of bed and visit the Shakespeare for the rest of the lines. A vague shadow stretches forth from the wall. Nameless fears and conscience besieges one. One is engulfed and absorbed in its depths. Morpheus's relentless grasp we cannot escape, and somnus reigns and holds sway. All too soon, the milkman shifts his gears in a most annoying manner. Apollo blatantly ushers his rays through the open window, and one wearily faces another day. Okay, so this is published in the Rafu Shimpo back in January 29th, 1934. Okay, so again, thank you to the Museum of Riverside for helping with this project. And again, this, and I'm sorry I didn't read it as sort of eloquently as I thought I would be able to, but I think it's really important for us to understand how, this terminology that's being used. I mean, she's using, Morpheus. This is not Morpheus from the Matrix, okay? For you folks, this is the Greek god of sleep that she's talking about. Somnus is the personification of sleep, right? This is Roman, right? So you're looking at someone that was very much sort of engulfed and engaged in the English language. I mean, words like gamble, right, and repast are some words that I had just recently learned from studying for the GRE. These are not terms that you use in sort of quotidian manners, right, in everyday manners, right? So again, this is a beautiful piece. I love it, and I'd really like to unpack it further with some of my colleagues. This is another piece, I guess, written by Carol Harada, or Sumi, aka Sumi, right? And this is a poem that I really enjoyed reading. It's a little bit dark, and to be honest, I thought it would be about Tadao when I first saw the sign, when I first saw the title. But this is another one that really struck a chord with me. So I'll go ahead and read this. I know you're going to hear my voice, and don't worry. Um, I'm not trying to put you all to sleep, but I really just been really amped up with, with reading these. So, Death of a Son. The lutes were hushed and still. The sun did sink like lead. The pride of Chi was ill. The light of Li was dead. The chant rose to a wail. The moon did climb so red. A mother wept so frail. The son of Li was dead. A father mourned his son. A young maid yet to wed did weep. The deed was done. The joy of Li was dead. So again, so she had written this for her Riverside High School annual in 1927, and then it was republished in the Kashu Mainichi in January 29th, 1934. So again, it spurns all kinds of it really opens up my imagination, really, really telling me how the community dynamic was, and sort of unpacking to say who was this person Chi, or who was this person Lee that had passed away. Again, these are really new sort of findings, and it's really sort of opens my eyes to see this sort of interconnection between the different communities that I think is so essential, because I think we want to compartmentalize these different racial groups, particularly within the Asian community, and I just don't think that that's true. I think that's not true at all. And this kind of speaks to that, right? It's not like proof, but it definitely shows that she was definitely engaged with maybe a different Asian, Asian community or Asian American community at the time. But we're all being very speculative too. And I think we really need to also make sure that we realize that this is all something that is very new. And I'm all just, again, sort of theorizing, but not necessarily grounding it in something. So this is part of the research process. So for those of my students who are sociology majors that are out there, this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? You got to make sure that you do the research, because you can't possibly come up with a conclusion just by reading one passage, right? Okay, so I'm gonna take a sip of water, and while I'm taking a sip of water, I was wondering if uh, Carol Park, my great friend and colleague, can read to this poem by Carol Harada.
Sure. Its title is To Alice. When I gaze upon your face, I cannot look away. You seem to be alive. A wish that you would speak. The eternal smile, which fairly drives me mad. Gay, twinkling eyes, and the curve of your chin. You fascinate me so. If I could but only embrace you. A photograph within a silver frame.
Thanks, Carol, for that. Yeah, and this was published back in February 4th, 1934 in the Ravu Shimpo. Now, she had also published this in a separate piece. Now, this is kind of interesting because there's no date on this one. And so I need to go back into an archive and see where else that she had published this. But, again, it really, we're not trying to speculate anything here, but what we're trying to see is this person, Sumi, right, or Carol Harada, this pseudonym, that she was writing under, really, had very strong emotions, right, and definitely felt very strongly, about writing this poem to Alice. So this is another poem written February 5th, 1938. Now, this is actually titled Sumi Harada. And this was actually with the help of Naomi Harada, she helping sort of decipher the handwriting. This is another poem that was very sort of emotionally powerful for me. And I was wondering if, Carol, you could possibly help with reading this one as well.
Sure. Title of the poem is You and I, Sumi Harada. And in this idyllic love, we too shall share the quiet stillness and beauty of being together, that close intimacy excluding all care and grievances for a short while, oblivious to passing time, pain, and bitterness. Each moment, a golden fancy, a bud about to blossom, a winged bird poised in flight. Such exquisite pain at parting, let me remember. And when my heart cries out in the dark of the night, as a soft fragrance fills the air, these thoughts will enfold me with serenity and radiances of a blessed love.
So again, the emotions really come out, but we also want to contextualize this too, right? Thinking about, okay, well, Sumi was probably in her late 20s, right, early 30s when these are being written. This is in 1938, so this is pre-World War II. But we also want to also think about this as the alien land law is right there too as well. Especially in California. So even though they had won that case, this is still something that is definitely a pervasive sort of racism that is happening against the community, and also for one to be able to sort of find the space to write with such eloquence, right? With these two poems, I think juxtaposed, really help us sort of understand an additional dimensionality to what Sumi had to really present. So this is called Southern Light, and this was published in the Kashu Mainichi. This is January 1st, 1934. You want to go for it, Carol, or?
If you want me to, sure.
I think you have a more poetic voice than I do for some reason. It just resonates stronger with me.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Sure, I'll take a crack at it. Southern Light by S. Carol Harada. Fresh and fragrant is the smell of newly mown hay. The pungent odor of sage brush is keen in the night air. Silvery moon bathes the whole landscape. The trunks of eucalyptus trees gleam, and the leaves rustle gracefully in the breeze. Surrounding hills are outlined in the sky, skillfully blended into harmony, an enchanting night. Imagine Pan piping a haunting melody on his reeds. Nostalgia, memories of a southern night.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting too. And thank you for mentioning how she had written her name. So she had actually written S. Carol Harada as another sort of pseudonym that she had used throughout her writing. And so again, this is very descriptive of nature, right? Trunks of eucalyptus trees gleam. Like this is a very imaginative vocabulary that Sumi has. This is again, something that opens my eyes and opens my imagination to sort of what the interpretation or what sort of state was she in terms of writing something so beautifully. And then another poem that Carol S. Harada. So she had moved the S, and now she's back into the S as the middle name. And this is there's no date on this one. No, this is but it was written November 10th, and this is titled Tomorrow. And I'll take a crack at it. So if y'all get bored with my voice, I'm sorry, but I'll take a crack at this one. Okay. The night is blacker than ever before. The endless tomorrows crowd and push their weary hours through. They chain me fast with heavy links, binding my awkward limbs to conform to laborious tasks. But wait, there is a jeweled space among the chain, a glowing gem, a brief someday. Too late to no avail, the tomorrows are too fleeting. Carol S. Harada, November 10th. So, again, this, it just shows, this sort of the labor that one goes through, right? Like our day to day, right? What does tomorrow bring? And I thought it was very fitting. What will tomorrow bring for sort of the archive and sort of how I will sort of try to unpack, with my further research. And lastly, this is an interesting poem. So My Mother is actually a poem that she had written after. So this poem is written in 1933, right, in June. But in the Lemon Street book, right, My Mother is another poem that she had written after her mother had passed away. So this is another poem of the same title, but this is when she had written it earlier in her life. So this is dedicated to her mother, and Carol Park. Maybe you could take a swing at it. Thanks.
Sure. Let's see here. My mother, S. Carol Harada. I love her. Such sweet companionship to a lonely daughter. I love her. Such loyal affection to an awkward daughter. I love her. That intimate confidant of her daughter. I love her because she is my mother.
So simple yet so sweet. And I think I've noticed that Sumi in particular was very close with her mother, and that just it resonates so deeply, even in her poetry, just the way that she had laid out some of the things in her albums. There's a very close relationship to her mother that I think resonates with the way that she had written with her writing. And so it just speaks volumes. And again, this is something that we're slowly trying to unpack. We're not trying to really look at the thick of everything or try to at this point, right? We're not really trying to overanalyze things. What does each sort of stanza or what does each line mean? But again, it really provides us a space for us to explore what Sumi really meant, um, or what others meant to Sumi, right? And how she had internalized a lot of these things, yet she had also this capability of expressing what she was internalizing in such a beautiful manner that I think um, you know it just speaks volumes. And I think this is the Sumi Harada that I think I would have liked to have known back in this sort of very turbulent time for Japanese Americans, and for her to sort of write so beautifully and so openly, and just how brave she was to publish a lot of these poems in these sort of Japanese newspapers. And again, I'm going to have to delve into the archive, like, reach out to different libraries, reach out to different databases to sort of unpack whether or not there are more of these publications, as well as, seeing what that sort of social context was, right? We want to contextualize these things because obviously I'm only seeing these for what they're worth for their poems. And I want to make sure that we kind of are able to sort of look at these through this deeper sort of lens and sort of shifting a little bit of that narrative. Let's see here. So now that we know this whole now that we've contextualized things, right? Now Sumi Harada, the intellectual, comes out. So this photo, which I had sort of requested a while back, and I really loved it because she's reading the paper, right? This is back from I think I wrote it down in my notes here. I think it's from like 1946. I want to say, yeah, 1946. So this is right at the time where the Oyama versus the state of California case was going on, right? So this is like alien land law is still happening, right? And even though in this local Riverside context, the Haradas were able to keep their home, right? There's these legal battles that are still going on, right? There's issues of citizenship, et cetera, that are happening, and and Sumi sitting here, I don't think she's reading the newspaper like we think of it as. I think she's like analyzing things, right? She's not just like, reading like the gossip column and seeing what I don't know what famous actors were. This is I think something that speaks more volumes now that we understand that she was this intellectually sort of driven person, right? There's this history of her having this friendship with Mineo Kubo, who's another famous Japanese American artist from Riverside, and they have this communication. So as friends, right? But maybe we can reimagine how that relationship was. Again, this is all very speculative, right? But maybe we can just reimagine how, these, how these two had interacted. Was it just a friendship, right? Was it more of like, kind of like how me and Carol are? We're always talking about, theories and ethnic studies and whatnot, right? Like we're always talking about these things. Like maybe this is the alternate universe that we can sort of unpack. Maybe this is the universe that she was in, and yet, you know, uh, but yeah, we still have to take the time to sort of reveal these things and sort of unravel these, because this is very layered, right? This isn't just like one thing, and we have to be responsible, obviously, to the family, and we have to be responsible to, everyone that's sort of involved, right? Because and that's where I come in as the researcher, right? Especially when we're doing like particularly research that's archival, to make sure that we're coming at it from the right space and making sure that we don't try too hard to rush things, even though this is very rushed. But I wanted to sort of get this out so that we could sort of unpack what Sumi I think means to the community, because she was definitely a voice in the community, right? Folks definitely gravitated towards her, and especially in the latter half of her, of her life. But I think early on, like she was definitely a very strong, intellectual, I know she at one point did go to Riverside Community College, but obviously unpacking some of that and seeing what kind of classes that she was taking. I mean, there's notebooks full of just biographies of Ernest Hemingway that pop up. I mean, wrote and wrote. And this is what I keep on telling my students, right? You got to continue to write. You got to continue to read to improve yourself. And this is what Sumi was doing. This is the project that she was working on. And maybe if incarceration hadn't happened, right? Maybe if these shifts in our history hadn't happened, maybe we would actually, be having a completely different discussion, in this moment right now. So, but and last but not least, kind of, wrapping things up, this is like a little bit of my reflection, right? Understanding the complex interactions and relationships that were maintained through very turbulent times, right? And so this kind of, resonates between, I think, the relationships that maybe she might have had with her family, right? Her friends, etc. But also just in general, right? And this sort of reflective exercise kind of gives us that sort of space to really reevaluate what it was like back in pre-World War II days, right? Understanding the multiple facets and intersections of an individual, right? We always talk about intersectionality, right, Carol? We've kind of read a lot about intersectionality, Patricia Collins, all of that. But like, what does that really mean? Like, what does that really mean when we're looking at it through a lens that, quite possibly could be literally repressing that or oppressing that, right? Like you're looking at a woman, a Japanese woman, right, in the 1930s, like someone that was probably having to deal with a lot of this sort of patriarchal, right, tug and pull of like these transnational countries, et cetera, right, that are going on, and also trying to figure out your own identity and your own culture, what it means to be an American, right, the age-old adage, so to speak. And then we have and then shifting our understanding of what it means to be an Asian American, and specifically a Japanese American. But I think just in general, like I think we oftentimes like to sort of contextualize things within like a group behavior, right? I mean, sociologists are all about that, right? This is what the Japanese did during this particular time. These are the shifts. This is what happened because of certain laws, etc. But maybe but we were all individuals, right? That had these distinct interests, right? And how that impacts us, I think, is that sort of shift away in sociology, and that sort of delves into like what ethnic studies really sort of reveals, right? Is like this whole notion of placement and how that genealogy or how that history really places one in their own sort of context, their own histories, right? I'm always telling my students, I wish I was born, in the 2000s, because I'd be Mr. Cool with my liking of anime and whatnot, right? So, but apparently I was born in a different time, in a different era, and not to like, not to marginalize what this discovery was like, but to sort of contextualize things. Okay.
This has been wonderful, Taka. I have so many thoughts and questions for you, and I know at this moment we're probably going to open it up to questions from the audience. But as people are typing their questions and formulating their thoughts on this, I just have a couple of comments for you and maybe a question or two in this as well. But through your presentation, you've reframed the way that we view Sumi Harada, right? There's some narratives that, like you said, portrayed her as the elderly, woman who was here in this house, who was the keeper of this house and so forth. But it's such a powerful thing you've done here by presenting to us Sumi Harada, the intellectual. I mean, those poems that we were reading, there were shades of like the romantics, right? Like that romantic period kind of style in the way that she wrote some of them, like of nature and of love and of identity and of all these different things. And her love and respect for her mother as well. I find it super fascinating that you were able to find this by digging in this archive, by pulling out these elements of her personhood, her identity, right, through her writing, through these pieces that she kept. I think you had mentioned she had kept a notebook or something, right, where she had kept some of her poetry. It's fascinating. I mean, it must have been so enlightening for you to see this, but do you think that might be an issue within our Asian American community and our history, where we are constantly framed in a certain perspective, whether it's through that model minority perspective? Because I think that might be what happened here with Sumi. right? She was framed as this very frail, demure woman, and when in fact she was just this very powerful intellectual who was hanging out with Minue. I can't say the last name. The
Mina,
artist, Akubo. Yes, she's
yeah.
hanging. I mean, right? And she's writing these profiles and these biographies on these authors, and just this intellectual, this powerhouse. That photograph you showed us of her reading the newspaper with that, you could see her thoughts, just those cogs just turning in her mind. Do you think this is something that we're going to be seeing as we dig into archives and history, that we might have to reframe the way that we think about some of our Asian American, you know, historical figures and stories? I mean, because this is amazing.
Yeah, I think so, and I think maybe revisiting these, I think, is necessary, right? It's not just about, you know, because you're right, like the framing of how we as Asian Americans, or we as, you know, have always been within. I mean, when we went to Manzanar the other day, you know, just seeing how it's framed in this particular context of like, the military being so essential, right? Like joining the military, right? This is always sort of like this streamline that I always see within the books that I've read, right? It's always, and it's a lot about like incarceration, a lot of the stuff that I've read about, and not to like sort of minimize that, because I think that experience is legitimate. I think it just, understanding that, I'm sure there were poets that went over and fought for the United States. There were probably writers and artists just like Mina Okubo or just like Sumi that were incarcerated, right? And a lot, and we were just fortunate enough that the Haradas, that Sumi had kept all of this. I mean, this is part of the sort of great tragedy, right, of what had happened, right, when folks were incarcerated and they weren't able to sort of, regain their possessions, right? How many of these had sketchbooks, right? How many of these, folks had these sort of, these their writing was taken away from them, their diaries, right? And so I think it's, but I think what we have, I think you can obviously look into that and sort of delve into that, and maybe as we sort of reframe things, and to recontextualize things, maybe this will be not necessarily like an alternative history, but like a history that's of the people, right? That's grounded, that's sort of internalized within a community that expresses, that it isn't just folks that were fighting this war and were really patriotic, right? There were folks that really were just trying to exist and wanting to do what they love to do, right? Like we love to read, we love to like study, and if we weren't provided that space, what would we have been doing, right? In the 1920s or the 1930s, like these are all the types of things that kind of come up. We're in an era where we're allowed to sort of explore these things, but sorry, um, technical difficulties, but yeah. So,
Yeah.
good question. Yeah, it's a great inquiry, and I hope so. I hope we see more of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And as I'm having a little conversation here with Taka, if you all would like to type your questions in the comment section, please feel free to do so, and I'll try to get to them, as many of them as I can. But do feel free to think about some questions about Sumi Harada, about the Harada House. And as you're doing that, as you're typing them in, Taka, I'm gonna just keep having this lovely conversation with you. I want to talk to you really quick about the Harada House itself. It's a National Historic Landmark. It is so representative of, I guess, that what you might call that story that we always grab onto, this American story of how there was this fight for something that the Haradas had worked for, right? $1,500, they bought it and so forth, and they had put it in their children's names, and so forth and so forth. And Sumi took it over, but this court case is fascinating to me, and I'm wondering if you might just elaborate a little bit more on it. I know the Alien Land Law in 1913, right? It prohibited Japanese Americans. It targeted Japanese Americans, but really applied to the Asian American community, and so the Haradas were specifically hit by this. But tell us what happened.
So
What
I guess,
happened? Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, so there was a huge public backlash, with obviously, Jukichi, purchasing this home in his children's names, right? But this is like a common practice, but obviously it was frowned upon, and yeah, the local sort of community decided to prosecute, and sort of figure out basically letting them know that they didn't belong there. There were these, there's this huge sort of, um, Judge Craig is the person that sort of jumps in and sort of, takes control of this court case, right? And so he kind of like, defiantly, rules in favor of the Haradas, even though there's sort of this sentiment that he should have not done that, right? Especially because he was going against basically the state. But he was also, I think there's a famous quote where he cites like the 14th Amendment, right? And I think, that's a really important and historic moment within the Harada, House's sort of history, right? The Harada House's history, and then that's what sort of leads us to this sort of fast forwarding, right, to the National Historic Landmark, and sort of realizing the importance and the significance of what this house is, and how it represents a lot of different things too. How it's like this sort of complex intersection of our histories too. We look at this court case, and yes, they were able to keep the home, but in reality, what happened, a few years or a decade or two later, where the whole family is now put into incarceration camps, right? What does that mean for ownership, right? What does that mean for ownership of homes, right? So it really further complicates, right, this pervasive sort of American imperialist sort of system that we're still a part of until today, right? The contradictions that we see, right? You can stay in your home, but not really, right? They were fortunate enough that they had a gentleman by the name of Jess Stabler who was able to sort of keep keep the home intact, and right, did not have to deal with some of the atrocities that we hear of that happened in LA or San Francisco, where folks' houses were basically raided, or they had to sell them at like a below market price, and just basically losing all of their sort of material possessions. The biggest one being their home.
Yeah,
So,
it very much sounds like it was a yellow peril fear reaction, right? I mean, incarceration was definitely that, right? So this whole notion of race, right, and identity and how it was tied to the community. I want to touch upon this as again, folks are coming up with their questions. Again, please feel free to type up a question and stick it in the chat, and we'll ask Taka here. We'll grill him a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to touch really quickly upon just this notion of race, identity, and community. You had mentioned it earlier through the recipes, I think it was, and some of her writings with the poem about the loss of Lee, right? There's often this narrative within our own Asian American communities that says things like, well, Korean Americans and Japanese Americans didn't quite get along. Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans didn't get along, but maybe the Koreans and the Chinese got along, but then we don't know, right? So there's all this, like you pointed out, speculation. And yet we are now seeing that perhaps this narrative wasn't true. She's written this poem. Sumi wrote this poem about someone who's very likely Chinese. Do you think that narrative will change as well as we dig through these archives and read the letters and personal stories of individuals who had these friendships with other ethnicities?
I think so. Yeah. And I would hope so. I mean, I just would never fathom, when we're, when you have, it's not like you're super isolated like we are today, right? I mean, you can definitely, I think, in a modern context, someone can just lock themselves in a room and just be on YouTube and Zoom all day, I guess, right? But you don't have that luxury. And I think the luxury that you had was interacting with folks, right? And I don't, and this goes back to Dr. Chang's discovery of the Pachapa camp and that Sambor map, right? And seeing how closely the Japanese camp, right, or the Japanese community was sort of placed, in the Korean camp, or in Pachapa camp, right? And obviously, I don't think it's all like everyone. Definitely, I'm sure there were tensions, right? This is a very transnational context that we have to frame it in, with the Hemet Valley experience and whatnot. So, but I think it's also really important for us to understand that maybe, this is very one-sided, almost like a patriarchal, like, man versus man kind of a thing, right? Do we really not, take into consideration that there were kids, there were children, right, that were playing, right? There were, women that had to go and buy groceries and shop, right? There were different vendors had to supply, food, obviously, right? There was a big agriculture community. So I, I think, with just looking further into that, but also sort of piecing that together, right? Instead of trying to, you know, create a particular narrative, right? I think it's really important to understand that, why don't we see if there's any sort of crossover? Maybe there were some like really invaluable friendships that have occurred, kind of like our friendship,
Mhm.
And so thinking about why, maybe just deconstructing that a little bit, maybe getting out of that. I don't know if it's a stereotype, but maybe getting out of this sort of framework that we're in, because there's so much pervasive sort of tension that I think happens, I think, because of what's happening overseas, right? And this is, very well documented within, this tension with obviously Japanese imperialism and these other sort of Asian countries like, Korea and South Korea, in particular, right? And so you kind of look at this and you think, okay, but this is the United States, right? This is a different context, but you're bringing a lot of that over. But I think there can be, and I'm hoping to find, right? And I don't want to force it, right? But I think what the poem that Sumi had, brought up when she had written this in high school, right? Someone named Chi in high school. I mean, this is again speculative, right? But maybe there's more integration than what we had expected. And this is something that I think is just the tip of the iceberg. And I wish I had more time with this, which I'm granting myself more time with this. And so hopefully at the time 2021 or 2023, we can come back and have a follow up and sort of figure out, what it is that we were able to unpack. Because as much as I want to talk about the Japanese American community, Carol, your research in the Korean American community, I think there's a lot of crossover, and I think this is where we can, this is where that sort of collective sort of mind kind of can work through this sort of space that this space that we're allotted. So
That's an excellent answer. Thank you, Taka. And we have some questions now coming through the chat. So let's go ahead. We have a couple of questions asking about how folks might learn more about the Harada House for those who want to be more educated on this subject. Can they go to a link somewhere? Is there a book that you might recommend, or?
yeah, definitely. So there's so thank you, Naomi Harada, my very dear friend, right? The House on Lemon Street by Mark Rawitch. So this is his graduate, I think his master's, I think, thesis that it extended into a book. And so this is really it's a book that I reference all the time, especially within the historical context. So I think it's a really good starting point, for you all to delve into. The Museum of Riverside also has a really good sort of more of like a snapshot, right, on their website about the Harada House. And also, there have been a couple articles, I think, written on Nami as well. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of content, and also recently, with recorded content as well, that you can sort of find out about the Harada House. But I would recommend, the book, to get a sort of at least a general sense of what this story was like, because that's like one of the definitive books that I think I'd be apropos if I didn't bring it up, right? Yeah, but again, it's the contextualization too. So
Awesome. And we have another question here from Nicole Herrera. What is the most interesting or shocking thing you've learned about the Harada House up to this point?
that's a great question, Nicole. Great to see you. And yeah, I think it's what we just read. I mean, the insomnia. I mean, I have lost so much sleep over trying to unpack this to prepare for this particular moment, because it's been so heavy. It's been so heavy on me, because it's obviously something that is very intimate, but at the same time, it really helps me sort of contextualize Sumi and her contribution to, I think, the English language, right? I mean, this is someone that is an artist, is a literary figure now in my eyes, and I think that was the most shocking, or most exciting, I guess. Shocking, I think, I think has a little bit of a negative connotation, but maybe exciting thing that I learned about. So thanks, Nicole, for that. Yeah.
Awesome. We have another question from George Gadaya. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Do they let people take a peek inside the house?
So right now, it's not. You're not allowed to take a peek in the house. It's definitely something that you will be eventually able to. So right now you can definitely go outside of it and sort of there's a couple plaques in front of the house, but you can't like jump the fence. Or I don't recommend doing anything like that. It's not safe, just because it's still under that planning and construction process. So like, but yeah, it's definitely there. Yeah, so I think driving by it and maybe this is the beauty of it, right? It looks like a normal house, right? It doesn't look like I think when we think of like a Japanese house, maybe we think of it like one of those old samurai movies, like with the tatami and all that. It doesn't look like that, and it looks like an American house, and I think that's like the allure of it too. It's like something that we would all live in, right? And so yeah, George, like definitely try to drive by next time that the next time that you're in Riverside. Yeah.
Awesome. We have another question from Jessica Urick. Do you know if the Harada family had support from other members of the Japanese community during the court case, or were they isolated from the rest of the community because of the case? It's an excellent question.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Like I know, some of my colleagues and some of my friends have definitely I know of its influence right within the community, right? But I can't really speak too eloquently on the particulars. But what I do know is that Jukichi the father, right, was going to go to like the Japanese community in like Los Angeles, I think, like the if the court case were to sort of continue on, right, it was going to be a bigger sort of transnational ordeal, and that was part of the issue with sort of this is kind of like a little bit of the critique, right, that goes into what Judge Craig really decided, right? Did he decide to sort of do this to mitigate a bigger problem, or right? And this is in Mark's book. There's a little blurb about that, where it's just like, or was it, because it was gaining so much press, because the community was definitely hearing about this, right? This was something that obviously affected the community, and the community was definitely going to push for it. And I think what ended up happening was, because the community was being very outspoken, that they were going to possibly have like their sort of home country kind of get more involved, and that was kind of like this sort of possible reason as to why this sort of decision was granted. But great question, and I think that's something that we can delve more into as I kind of go into my research, for sure. Thank you.
Excellent. And as folks are still formulating their questions, we've been having some great questions here too. Please keep putting them in the comment section. We have a little more time. But yeah, put them in the comment section and we'll get to them as they come in. But Taka, I also want to just kind of keep having this conversation with you since we have extra time right now. You've been discussing these geopolitical situations, right? These conditions that affected just how certain cases and things were happening here in the States. I mean, of course, the Alien Land Law in 1913, right? They wanted to stop Japanese Americans and Asian Americans from owning land, from working, from right having jobs and these different things. And then you had brought it up briefly, the Hemet Valley incident of also 1913, and when anti-Asian sentiments were very, very high. I mean, extremely high, really, at that moment in history. And that correlates a little bit with what was happening geopolitically. And at the same time, we're having, all this stuff going on with the Harada House. We're having all this stuff going on with the Korean American community, with the Japanese American community, all these different things. But do you think that these we're going to contextualize this into today's times. Do you think that these geopolitical situations continue to affect how decisions and the way we perceive certain things about our Japanese American community or Korean American community or other Asian American communities, does that still affect us today? Or do you think that was just a historical moment? Or are we still dealing with that?
I think we're still dealing with that. I think it's maybe less like because I think with globalization, right? With globalization, with having a smaller world, I think we're dealing with this. I think with how manufacturing is going, has gone overseas, right? All of these like tariffs and whatnot, and dealing with like international trade and imports and exports. I think so, and I think we all have to realize that these economic systems are definitely politically driven, right? For capital, and we have to realize that this is something that is a continuous sort of stream, and I think it's more, maybe it's coded more, maybe it's a little more savvier, maybe it's a little less sort of in your face as it was back in the 1930s or 1910s or whenever that was happening. But I think it's a really important discussion to be had, that it is something that I think we see just because of like this, are you talking more specifically about sort of geopolitical sort of tensions, I guess, between different countries, and then how it affects the community
Yes.
as well?
Yes.
Because I think that happens. I think you see that in some of the Koreatown signage, right? That I've seen in LA when there's when they're kind of bringing up things that are happening with the tensions between Japan and Korea and how they kind of impact how the community views, you know, a particular community here, right? But I mean that's for something to sort of delve into, obviously, for us to sort of look further within sort of modern context. But I think if we've known anything about these genealogies, right, they all start from somewhere and they all kind of find themselves, into the thick of it today. I mean, you look at the Muslim ban, right? This is something that I had done my thesis on at Cal State Fullerton, and that was all, that was, that was preventing folks from different countries to come into the United States. Like these kind of things are, have happened in our lifetimes, and I think it's really important for us to sort of think that this isn't like a new history, and that this is something that has been pervasive within the United States, as hard as that might be for some of us who live here and who have our families here and are trying to grow, right? But it's a critique that I think is necessary for us, in order for us as a country to grow, right?
It sounds like this is definitely a lesson we are learning from the story of the Harada House, too. And before we get to this final question, can you kind of bring us to where we are now with the Harada House, the Harada family? Where are they now? Kind of that kind of question is how's everything going?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think maybe it should be geared towards maybe some of the folks that I do speak with, with at the family. I'm not, I deal with, I think Naomi and I are sort of texting and sort of, discussing certain things at different points in time, and who's become a very strong ally with my project. So, big shout out to Naomi for her involvement with my research. But thinking, but yeah, I mean, there are close, family members that are, still sort of, around, and they've presented, at various points in time. But yeah, like I said, I'm still like, I guess how do we say it? I'm still trying to build, you know, sort of this reputation. I don't know what you want to call it. Just I'm trying to, still build myself up within the community. Like this is something that's very new again, and I'm just trying my best to sort of, understand the family, right, and understanding the importance of this family, and also understanding how this relates to my own identity, right? How I view myself as a Japanese American, and sort of being able to sort of contextualize things of what it might have been like if I was alive in the 1930s. But the family, I think, has been very strong advocates and of the museum and the preservation process, and so I know that their involvement has been very, very very important to the museum, to the city of Riverside, and also to the local community as well. So, yeah.
And it sounds like that the Harada House is going through a renovation and will be open eventually to the public. Is that right? Or how's that like?
Yeah, so this is again, these are very recent revelations, right? The $7 million that was allotted from the state of California was a huge a huge deal for the museum and for all of us, working to sort of, working, within the Harada spectrum, the Harada family, the Harada House spectrum, right? Because, they're building an interpretive center as well.
Uh-huh.
That's sort of like adjacent or like across the street, I think, from the Harada House as well. That's going to be a community space. So there are these different projects that I know that are sort of in the works, and obviously there's a lot of folks that are involved that I think have the best interest of the family and sort of the legacy that's been provided. So, I'm just I'm just really, fortunate to be in that space to really see the progress, right? I mean, if you would have said, 6 months ago that they would have gotten that award, given all this sort of all the budget cuts and with COVID going on, I would have not thought that we would have gotten it. the $7 million so quickly. So I'm really happy, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully working with the museum, but if not, in a capacity to enjoy it as a patron as well. So
Right. It just sounds like a lot of good things are going to be happening for that house that's still standing, which is wonderful and such a great symbol for our community. We have a couple of comments here and then a question from Brooke Olson. Is there anything us viewers can do now to show and give support? And then there's a couple of comments I'll go ahead and read after. So yeah, is there anything us as viewers can do now to show and give support?
Yeah, definitely. You can definitely, check out the Museum of Riverside. I know that they are, they're a very strong proponent of the Harada House, and the projects that are there. So supporting, I think reaching out to them, and I know they do accept donations as well. So I think that'd be a really great starting point in terms of supporting. But obviously, being engaged with the community, is one thing as well, and checking out the site. And there's I think I know there's a project in the works of sort of there's different projects, I guess, in the wings right now. So I think just stay tuned. I guess is the best way I can put it. So I think hopefully y'all will be able to sort of engage with it. Obviously, y'all can talk to me about it as well. And sort of pick my brain too as well, because I think this is an interesting community space for us to sort of explore. So
awesome. Here's another question before we get to the comments again from Cumulus25. Is there any correspondence between Sumi and Mine Okubo in the latter's archives?
That's a great question. And if I, that's part of what's interesting is I actually found, just a little bit of it was like this, I think it was like her address, Mine Okubo's address. That was, I think it was Mine Okubo that had written the address. It was like her address in New York, because she was living in New York at the time, right? She had moved there to pursue her career as an artist. And so, those are the types of correspondences that I know exist, right? I mean, I think I was just recently reading, Mark's book, and he had mentioned that, there's like a plate set that Mine had given to Sumi. So there was this very close relationship. But yeah, I mean, if I, that's part of, the uncovering of it, right? There's so much out there that, and it's a delicate process. It's not like something that I can just sort of click through, right? And just sort of copy, paste, drag, do whatever, on a computer. This is something that is very delicate, it's very hands-on. So, time is also of the essence, but also being very meticulous with what we're looking at. So, something like with her communication with Mine, what I think is somewhere, maybe it is available, but I just haven't, come across it at this point. But yeah, that would be something that would be really great. But I know that there was a really great bond between Sumi and Mine, and it's obviously very clear why. I think they both came at things through a very much, this literary or this almost artistic perspective. Reading, Citizen 13660, you definitely can feel, the atrocities of incarceration, right? And so seeing how Sumi was also a writer, it just, I can see the convergence, and at least, and sort of having similar wavelengths or similar thoughts. So.
Right. And we have comments here from Kimiko Klein, the niece of Sumi. And the first comment is, my memory as a niece of Auntie Sumi is that she was not allowed to pursue a profession because she was a woman. Her brothers became dentists, doctors, and speech therapists. And she also says, again, Kimiko Klein, to me, this is a tragic thing because Auntie Sumi was so very intelligent, but spent her adult life first caring for her parents and then cleaning other folks' homes. So this is something, I mean, yes, that Taka, you have been reframing for us, presenting to us Sumi Harada, the intellectual. And from what you have been showing us and telling us, as you have been, again, digging through this archive, yeah, absolutely. She was an intellectual, smart, a writer, an artist, a thinker, all these wonderful things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's and thank you, Kimiko, for that insight, right? Because I think it's really important to contextualize things, right? What it was like to be a woman in the 1910s or the 1920s, right? This is heavily frowned upon, right? To sort of pursue something like writing, or to pursue, a career, right? You're supposed to just, stay by, your man's side, kind of a, this is like the time, right? This isn't now where like we're juggling multiple jobs and, right, dual learning households. Um, and yeah, it is tragic, but to see how she had spent her adult life, caring for her parent, or for others, and also ending up, sort of as a maid, cleaning houses. But I don't want to envision that. I think that kind of, I'd like to think, of highlighting, right, some of the great things that I think Sumi contributed or can contribute to our community today, posthumously, right? Because I think it's really important for us to sort of view some of the strength that she had, right? Some of the boldness, like that definitely resonates with what how she's described, or how folks that have known her have described her. But really, focusing on the beautiful writing that she had, and seeing how that can sort of maybe, inspire, my daughter, right, to become a writer, right? Maybe inspire someone else to pursue what they would like, in that sort of context. Because I think Sumi is an extremely great role model, right? She was given awards for her contributions to the community in Riverside. She won the YWCA, Women of the Year award, I think, at one point. She had given lectures and talks at UC Riverside about the experiences of being incarcerated. So, that's the Sumi that I think we should all try to, focus on and remember. And it is tragic and it is sad, but I think maybe Sumi would like for us to sort of, take a gander at some of the beautiful poetry that she had written.
Awesome. Well, I think we did go over a little bit with time, but this is such a fascinating conversation and topic. Thank you so much, Professor Taka, and to the audience, and to Kamiko and Naomi, and to all the Harada House and the Harada family members and folks who are supporting. Thank you for attending today's wonderful lecture. If you have any other thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free to stick around for the next couple minutes and grill Taka a little bit.
No, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Naomi, thank you for your very insightful comments. I mean, this is something that I think, I've been really sort of delving into and thinking too much about, maybe, or really thinking of it, thinking about what this uncovering means, right? And so, if it wasn't for Naomi's support, like, I don't think I would be in this position to feel comfortably to talk about this. So, thank you to the family, thank you to the Museum of Riverside. Like, this is really such a great. Oh, and one other thing I do want to mention before I do my thank yous is that we have extra credit, right? So all the folks that are in here for the extra credit. So the extra credit word, okay, and I'll pull up a prompt, okay? So basically you'll get 5 points, whichever class you're in, and basically the key word is Sumi Harada. So the keyword is Sumi Harada. So if you put that keyword in there, you can give me some comments or some feedback, but as long as you put that in there, you'll get the 5 points. And obviously, if you're watching this recording at a later time, you got to sit through the whole hour and 15. But at the same time, it'll count too as well. So obviously, this goes for my classes this fall semester. But yeah, so keyword is again Sumi, Sumi, and last name Harada. So can I put that in the chat? I don't know if I can put that in the chat, but hopefully you can re-watch this little portion, but it's Sumi Harada. Okay, so it's great seeing y'all. Like my class, like they love me. No, so but I appreciate everyone. Like I appreciate everyone, and I do apologize for sort of being a little nervous, for early on, but I did my best. So and hopefully we can discover this as we move forward. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Thank you to Daima for the platform. Have a great evening, everyone. If you want to stick around for a little bit, we'll stick around. But otherwise, take care.